The sun was a hammer, and the trail was the anvil. It beat down on the cracked, thirsty earth of the Arizona Territory, on the sparse, skeletal arms of the saguaro, on the hunched shoulders of the two men, and the unmoving mule that stood between them. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything. The sweat-darkened leather of the harnesses, the sweat-stained rim of Tobias McGraw's hat, the flushed, frustrated face of Finn Talbot. It was a silence filled with noise, the drone of a horsefly, the faint, dry whisper of wind through creosote, the thud of Finn's own impatient heart in his ears. But the most profound sound was the silence from the mule. Copper, a beast of legendary stubbornness and unnerving intelligence, had planted his 4 hooves 3 hours ago, and had not moved a single inch since. His long ears were cocked, not in defiance, but in a state of deep, unnerving attention, fixed on a patch of earth just ahead that looked no different from any other mile of sun-scorched dirt they had crossed. "It's the heat," Finn said, for the 10th time. His voice was raw, fraying at the edges. "Or maybe a snake, or he's just being a damn mule." He kicked a loose stone, sending it skittering into a brittle bush. The sound was sharp, an unwelcome intrusion into the simmering quiet. Tobias McGraw didn't answer. He ran a gnarled, leathery hand down Copper's neck, his touch a familiar comfort that the mule accepted with a slight twitch of its hide. Tobias was a man carved from the land itself, his face a roadmap of ravines and sun-baked mesas, his eyes the color of a faded blue sky, holding a calm that seemed as vast and unshakable as the horizon. He'd been skinning mules since before Finn was born, and he'd learned the most important lesson early. You don't tell a mule, you ask, and when a mule like Copper gave you an answer this firm, you listened. "He ain't hot," Tobias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Watered him at the last creek, and it ain't a snake. He'd be shying back, not standing guard." He squinted, his gaze following Copper's, settling on that same innocuous patch of trail. "He's holding vigil." Finn scoffed, wiping a sleeve across his brow, smearing grime and sweat. "Holding vigil over what?" "Dirt. There's nothing there, Tobias, nothing." The boy, and at 19, for all his wiry strength, he was still a boy, was a creature of logic, of cause and effect. A mule stops because it's tired, thirsty, or spooked. This was none of those. It was a violation of the natural order of things, an infuriating, time-wasting mystery. Their cargo, a load of dry goods and mining equipment for the Silver Creek encampment, was already 2 days late. Mr. Abernathy would dock their pay, and it would be Finn's share that felt the cut most keenly. "Something we can't see," Tobias murmured, more to himself than to Finn. He trusted Copper's intuition more than he trusted most men's eyesight. He'd seen the mule refuse to cross a washed-out bridge moments before it collapsed into a ravine. He'd seen him shy from a prospector who, a day later, was found to be sick with cholera. The animal possessed a sense that hummed on a frequency below human hearing, a primal knowledge of the world that paid no mind to logic or schedules. Finn let out an exasperated sigh, the sound swallowed by the immense, indifferent landscape. "So what do we do? Camp here until he decides this particular patch of ground is no longer offensive to his delicate sensibilities?" The sarcasm was thick, a flimsy shield against the growing unease that pricked at him. It was more than just the mule's behavior. The silence felt wrong. The heat felt predatory. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Tobias's eyes didn't leave the spot. It was a subtle thing, easily missed. The dirt was a shade darker, a touch more disturbed than the surrounding sun-bleached earth. It was as if something had been turned over recently, though there were no tracks, no sign of human passage other than their own. "Unhitch him," Tobias said, his voice quiet but firm. "We'll lead him around, if he'll go." The task was a struggle. Copper resisted, his body a solid, unyielding anchor of muscle and bone. He shook his head, the harness jingling a discordant protest. It took all of Finn's strength and Tobias's patient coaxing to pull the mule sideways, to lead him in a wide arc around the unsettling patch of trail. Even then, Copper's head remained turned, his dark liquid eyes fixed on the spot, his ears swiveling like compass needles drawn to a magnetic north. Once they were past it, he walked willingly enough, the familiar rhythm of his gait returning, but the tension remained in the set of his neck. They tethered him to a gnarled mesquite tree a good 50 yards down the trail. The mule immediately began to graze on some dry scrub, but he never took his eyes off the place he had refused to cross. He watched it the way a dog watches the door for its master. "See?" Finn said, his relief making him bold. He just needed to get around it. Wasted half a day for nothing. Tobias didn't share his relief. He pulled the shovel from the side of the wagon, its metal scraping against the wooden frame. The sound was unnervingly loud. He walked back, his steps slow and deliberate, his weathered face set in a grim mask of concentration. The unease that had been a low hum in Finn's gut was now a ringing in his ears. "What are you doing?" Finn asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm trusting my mule," Tobias said without looking back. He stopped directly over the dark patch of earth. He planted his worn boots, spat on his hands, and gripped the shovel's handle. The sun beat down on his bent back. He looked old, suddenly, vulnerable. A man who ignores an animal's fear is a fool. A man who ignores Copper's certainty is a dead man. Finn's throat went dry. He watched, frozen, as Tobias drove the shovel into the ground. The earth gave way with a soft, yielding sigh, unnaturally so. It wasn't the hard, compacted soil of a well-worn trail. It was loose, wrong. The first shovelful came up, dark and rich, smelling faintly of something acrid and sweet beneath the dust. Tobias tossed it aside. He dug again, and again. The hole grew, a dark wound in the pale flesh of the desert. The rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel became a kind of funereal drumbeat. Finn found he couldn't look away. The frustration he'd felt just minutes ago had curdled into a cold, creeping dread. Every line of Tobias's body spoke of a grim purpose, a reluctant duty. He was not just digging a hole. He was unearthing a question that the desert had tried to swallow. The sun climbed higher, bleaching the color from the sky. The heat was a physical weight. Sweat dripped from Tobias's chin, falling into the hole he was digging. He worked with a steady, relentless rhythm, the muscles in his back and shoulders cording under his thin cotton shirt. Finn stayed by the wagon, his hand resting on Copper's flank, drawing a strange comfort from the animal's solid presence. The mule remained preternaturally still, his gaze locked on the unfolding scene. He wasn't grazing anymore. He was bearing witness. Then the sound changed. The shovel, which had been sinking into the soft earth with a muffled shush, struck something with a dull thump. Not a rock. It was a soft, yielding impact. Tobias froze, his body rigid. He leaned on the shovel, breathing heavily, his head bowed. The silence that rushed in was absolute, heavier than the heat. Finn's heart hammered against his ribs. "What is it?" he whispered. Though he knew Tobias couldn't hear him, he knew, and he didn't want to know. Tobias knelt slowly, his old knees cracking in protest. He reached into the shallow hole, his hand disappearing into the darkness of the disturbed soil. He worked his fingers through the dirt with a terrible gentleness. Finn could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful precision of his movements. When his hand re-emerged, it was caked in dark earth. He brushed it away, revealing a small scrap of fabric. It was blue calico, the pattern faded but still visible. A woman's dress. A cold wave washed over Finn, a phantom chill in the furnace of the day. This was no longer an inconvenience. It was not a mystery. It was a desecration. He felt a desperate urge to run, to climb onto the wagon and whip the mule into a gallop, to leave this place and its secrets behind. But his feet were rooted to the ground as firmly as Copper's had been. Tobias looked up, his eyes meeting Finn's across the shimmering air. There was no surprise in his expression, only a profound, weary sadness. A confirmation of a fear he had been nursing all along. He tossed the scrap of cloth aside and began to dig again, this time with his hands, scooping away the soil with a grim, methodical care. The smell grew stronger now, a cloying, sickly sweet odor of decay that the dry earth had failed to contain completely. It was the smell of old death, of secrets left to rot. Finn finally forced his legs to move, walking toward the hole as if drawn by some morbid gravity. He stopped a few feet away, peering into the shallow depression, and then he saw it. Breaking through the dark soil, pale and waxy, were the unmistakable shapes of human fingers. They were curled slightly, as if reaching for something. On the third finger of that small, delicate hand, a simple, thin band of gold caught the brutal sunlight, winking like a malevolent star. A wedding ring. The world tilted. Finn staggered back, a strangled cry catching in his throat. He clapped a hand over his mouth, the taste of bile and dust rising, the heat, the silence, the mule's strange behavior. It all snapped into a horrific, undeniable focus. They were not standing on a patch of trail. They were standing on a grave, a clandestine, unmarked, unhallowed grave. Copper hadn't been stubborn, he'd been respectful. He had refused to tread on the dead, and in doing so, he had refused to let them be forgotten. The quiet of the desert was no longer peaceful. It was the quiet of a tomb. The air itself seemed thick with the presence of the silenced victim, a truth demanding to be heard. Finn looked from the pale, unearthed hand to Tobias's grim face, and then to the vast, empty horizon. But it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watchful, and for the first time in his life, Finn Talbot was truly, deeply afraid. He understood now that the greatest danger wasn't the heat or the emptiness of the land, but the secrets that men buried within it. And they had just dug one up. Tobias rose to his feet, his face a mask of stone. He picked up the shovel, not to dig, but to lean on, like a staff. His eyes scanned the horizon, the low-lying hills, the distant shimmering mesas. He wasn't looking at the landscape anymore. He was searching for a threat. "Cover it back up," Finn croaked, his voice thin and reedy. "Tobias, for God's sake, cover it up and let's go. This is none of our business." "It became our business," Tobias said, his voice flat. The moment Copper stopped. "It became our business when I put a shovel in the ground." He gestured with his chin toward the body. "That's someone's daughter, someone's wife. We don't leave her here like this, not for the coyotes." The moral authority in his voice was absolute, cutting through Finn's fear. It wasn't a debate. It was a statement of fact, a law of the wilderness more fundamental than any statute written in a book. You don't desecrate the dead, and you don't abandon them. But Finn's terror was a living thing, a frantic animal clawing at the inside of his chest. This wasn't just a body. It was a murder, and murderers, he knew, often stayed close to their secrets. They guarded them. As if summoned by the thought, a new sound breached the oppressive silence. It was faint at first, a rhythmic disturbance on the edge of hearing. Hoofbeats, steady, deliberate, and coming closer. It wasn't the plodding gait of a prospector's lone donkey or the ambling of stray horses. It was the sound of riders with a purpose. Tobias's head snapped up. He grabbed Finn by the arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled him back toward the wagon. "Get behind it. Stay low." Finn scrambled behind the relative safety of the wagon wheels, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He peeked through the spokes, his eyes wide. Copper stood his ground, his ears swiveling toward the approaching sound, a low rumble starting in his chest. Tobias stood beside the wagon, the shovel held loosely in one hand, his other resting near the worn butt of the rifle holstered to his saddle. He was calm, terrifyingly so. He was a man who had seen the world's ugliness before and was not surprised to see it again. 3 riders crested the low rise to the east. They were dark silhouettes against the blinding glare of the sun, their forms wavering in the heat haze. For a moment, they were just shapes, anonymous and menacing. Then they drew closer, resolving into men on horseback, their faces hard and shadowed by the wide brims of their hats. They rode with an easy, confident arrogance that spoke of familiarity with the land and the violence it could hold. The man in the lead was younger than Tobias, perhaps 40, with a face that might have been handsome once, but was now pulled taut by some inner torment. His eyes, even from a distance, seemed to burn with a dark, restless energy. He was flanked by two other men, rougher sorts, their hands resting casually on the pistols at their hips. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from the wagon, forming a loose, menacing semicircle that effectively cut off any path of retreat. The landscape, which had felt so vast and open just minutes before, now felt like the tight confines of a cage. The air crackled with a new, sharper tension. The lead rider's gaze swept over the scene, the wagon, Tobias, the hidden form of Finn, the patient mule, before settling, inevitably, on the disturbed patch of earth and the discarded shovel lying beside it. A flicker of something, recognition, fury, fear, crossed his face before he masked it with a veneer of cold authority. "That's far enough," Tobias said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. It was not a request. The lead rider dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft dust. He moved with a stiff, deliberate grace, his eyes never leaving Tobias. "This is Henderson land you're on," he said, his voice tight, controlled. "You're trespassing. Trail's a public right-of-way," Tobias countered, his posture relaxed but ready. "Been using this trail for 20 years, never been Henderson land before." "Things change," the man said. His gaze flickered again to the shallow grave, and his jaw tightened. "My name is Caleb Henderson. My family owns this valley now. All of it." Finn's blood ran cold. Henderson. The name echoed in his mind. The Hendersons were new to the territory, a family that had bought up the old Bartee Ranch and a vast swath of the surrounding land with a sudden, unexplained flood of money. They were rumored to be reclusive, protective of their property to the point of hostility. Now, the reason for that hostility seemed sickeningly clear. "We mean no trouble," Tobias said, his voice even. "Our mule took a notion to stop. We were just getting on our way." It was a lie, a flimsy attempt to de-escalate, to pretend they hadn't found what they had found, but the shovel and the dark, violated earth told a different story. Caleb Henderson took another step forward, his eyes locking onto the glint of gold from the ring finger of the unearthed hand, a glint only visible from his angle. His composure shattered. A mask of raw animal panic flashed across his features, followed by a wave of pure, cold rage. It was the look of a man whose darkest secret had just been dragged, kicking and screaming into the light of day. "You had no right," he snarled, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You had no right to dig here." One of his men, a lanky, sallow-faced gunman, drew his pistol with a lazy, practiced motion. The click of the hammer being cocked was like a gunshot in the ringing silence. The other man shifted in his saddle, his hand hovering over his own weapon. They were no longer just landowners protecting their property. They were guards, jailers of a secret buried in the dirt. Finn felt a wave of nausea. They were trapped. The shovel was a pathetic weapon against 3 armed men. Tobias's rifle was still in its scabbard. They were caught, red-handed, at the scene of a crime, and the criminals themselves were now the judge, jury, and executioners. The midpoint of their journey had become its terrifying, bloody end. The heat, the dust, the waiting silence. It had all been a prelude to this, to a confrontation under the unforgiving eye of the sun, with a shallow grave at their feet, and death staring them down from the barrel of a gun. Caleb Henderson's haunted eyes met Tobias's steady gaze, and in that silent, charged moment, Finn knew that no one was walking away from this patch of ground until the debt of its secret was paid in full. The world seemed to shrink to the space between the wagon and the 3 riders, a pocket of reality supercharged with unspoken threats. The air was so thick with tension, Finn felt he might choke on it. Every sound was magnified. The creak of saddle leather as one of the hired guns shifted his weight, the impatient stamp of a horse's hoof, the low, guttural rumble that continued to vibrate in Copper's chest. The mule was a statue of coiled energy, his neck arched, his eyes fixed on Caleb Henderson with an unnerving, almost accusatory stillness. "Now," Caleb said, his voice regaining a sliver of its composure, though it was brittle as dried glass. "You're going to fill that hole back in. You're going to forget what you saw, and you're going to ride out of this valley and never look back." He took a step closer, his hand gesturing toward the shovel. "Pick it up." Tobias didn't move. His gaze was steady, unwavering, fixed on Caleb. It wasn't a defiant stare. It was something deeper, something that seemed to peel back the layers of Caleb's rage, to see the frantic, guilty thing squirming beneath. "A man's got to be able to look himself in the mirror in the morning," Tobias said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a lifetime of conviction. "And I can't do that knowing what's in that hole, knowing you mean to leave her there." "What's in that hole is my family's business," Caleb hissed, spittle flying from his lips. "A private matter. Murder ain't a private matter," Tobias stated, the words hanging in the dead air like a verdict. "It's a stain, and it spreads." The lanky gunman took a step forward, his pistol leveled at Tobias's chest. "The boss told you to pick up the shovel, old man." From behind the wheel, Finn watched, paralyzed. His mind was a maelstrom of terror. This was it. This was how it ended. A nameless grave on a forgotten trail. His life so full of unformed dreams, of owning his own small plot of land, of maybe finding a girl in Prescott, of simply growing old, was about to be extinguished over a stranger's bones and an old man's principles. He cursed Tobias's stubbornness. He cursed the mule. Why couldn't they have just kept going? Why did they have to stop? Why did they have to dig? Guilt warred with his fear. The woman in the grave deserved justice. He knew that, but the instinct to survive was a screaming primal force, overriding everything else. Caleb's face was a mess of conflicting emotions. The rage was there, but beneath it, Finn could see a deep, cavernous exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a terrible weight for too long, and the discovery was not just a threat, but a perverse kind of relief. The constant, draining effort of keeping the secret hidden was over. "I'm giving you one last chance," Caleb said, his voice ragged. "For your sake. Fill it in." It was then that Copper, who had been a creature of absolute stillness, finally moved. It wasn't the slow, stubborn planting of his feet. It was an explosion. With a sound that was half bray, half scream of pure fury, the mule lunged forward. He was not aiming for the men, but for the space between them, a massive, charging beast of muscle and righteous indignation. The tether rope to the mesquite tree snapped, with a sound like a rifle shot. The sudden, violent chaos shattered the standoff. The gunman nearest the wagon, startled by the 1,000-pound animal charging past him, flinched. It was all the opening Tobias needed. He wasn't a young man, but his movements were brutally efficient. He swung the heavy, flat-headed shovel not like a tool, but like a battle axe. It connected with the gunman's wrist with a sickening crunch of bone. The man screamed, his pistol clattering to the dust. The second gunman, still on his horse, reacted, raising his weapon. But Finn, jolted from his paralysis by the sheer adrenaline of the moment, acted on pure instinct. He snatched a heavy blacksmith's hammer from the wagon bed and hurled it with all his might. The throw was clumsy, desperate, but it found its mark, striking the man's horse hard on the flank. The animal shrieked and bucked wildly, unseating its rider, who tumbled to the ground in a heap. Everything devolved into a whirlwind of dust, panicked shouts, and the terrified shrieking of horses. Caleb Henderson stood in the middle of it, momentarily forgotten, his face a mask of disbelief. He drew his own pistol, his hand trembling, trying to make sense of the chaos. Tobias was on the first gunman, disarming him completely, his face grim and focused. The second gunman was struggling to get to his feet, his leg twisted at an awkward angle. Copper, his charge complete, had wheeled around and now stood near the shallow grave, his body a living shield, his ears laid back, his teeth bared. He had not attacked, but his intervention had been as decisive as a cavalry charge. He had shattered the enemy's formation and broken their focus. And then, Caleb's psychological dam, eroded by years of guilt and worn thin by the terror of this discovery, finally burst. The chaos of the gunfight was nothing compared to the storm breaking inside him. He raised his pistol, but he wasn't aiming at Tobias or Finn. He pointed it toward the sky, his knuckles white, his whole body shaking with violent tremors. "Stop!" he screamed, his voice a raw, broken thing, torn from the deepest part of his soul. "Just stop!" The fighting faltered. Tobias paused, breathing heavily, his foot on the chest of the groaning gunman. Finn, clutching another hammer, froze halfway out from behind the wagon. The unseated rider moaned, clutching his leg. The only sounds were the ragged breathing of the men and the nervous stamping of the horses. Caleb's face crumpled. The rage, the authority, the menace. It all dissolved, leaving behind the face of a man utterly broken, haunted by ghosts only he could see. Tears streamed down his dusty cheeks, carving clean paths through the grime. "It wasn't me!" he sobbed, the words ripping out of him in a torrent. "I didn't kill her! Not her!" He gestured wildly at the grave, his pistol waving precariously. "That's Maria, my brother's wife. Thomas. He did it. He had a temper, a greed that was like a sickness. He thought she was stealing from him, from us." The confession, once started, could not be stopped. It was a flood of poison that had been building for years, now spewing forth into the shocked silence of the desert. "He killed her right here, bashed her head in with a rock. I came up on them. I saw it. I saw what he did." Caleb's voice was a choked, guttural mess. "He told me to help him bury her. He said it was family business, that we had to protect the family, the name, the money." He staggered toward the grave, falling to his knees beside it, his pistol dropping unheeded into the dust. He stared at the pale, unearthed hand, as if mesmerized by it. "But that wasn't the start," he whispered, his eyes wide and vacant, looking back into a past that was more real to him than the present moment. "Thomas, he learned his greed from our father, but our father had a conscience, a weak one, but it was there. He found out Thomas was cheating the new land office, faking claims. He was going to turn him in. So Thomas, he killed him too, out in the canyons, made it look like a fall." Finn and Tobias exchanged a look of horrified disbelief. This was more than a single murder. This was a dynasty of evil, a family history rotted clean through by greed. "But it didn't stop," Caleb continued, rocking back and forth on his knees, his hands clutching his head. "Maria had a sister, Rosa Martinez. She came looking for her. She was smart, Rosa. She didn't believe the story we told that Maria had run off back east. She kept asking questions, poking around. She talked to one of the old ranch hands, Ezra Whitmore, a man who'd been loyal to our father. He knew things. He suspected something about father's accident." Caleb's breath hitched, a dry, rattling sob. "Thomas told me to handle it, to get rid of them. He sent a man with me, a hired gun, to make sure I did it right. I was supposed to just scare them off, but Rosa wouldn't be scared. She called me a coward, said I was letting my brother turn me into a monster." He looked up, his eyes pleading with Tobias, with the empty sky. "I didn't want to. I swear I didn't. But Thomas, he had this hold on me. He said they were a threat to everything. So I did it. I killed them, both of them, Rosa and old Ezra, buried them up by the dry wash." He pointed a shaking finger north, toward a line of dark mesas. "They're up there, together." The confession hung in the air, monstrous and complete. The gunman with the broken wrist stared at Caleb with a look of pure disgust. The one with the twisted leg had pushed himself into a sitting position, his face pale with shock. This was not the simple job of scaring off trespassers they had signed up for. They were accessories to a family of butchers. The second gunman, the one who'd been thrown from his horse, spoke, his voice raspy. "The other one, the fella Thomas sent with you. Where is he?" Caleb let out a laugh that was more like a cry of pain. "He rode off, that night, after I did it. He looked at me, at what I'd become, and he just shook his head. He said, "I was hired to keep folks off your land, Henderson, not to watch you murder women and old men." He took his pay, and he was gone by morning. Said he was riding for Prescott, said some sins you can't wash off. In that moment, the entire brutal, tragic story was laid bare. Thomas, the source of the evil; Maria, the first victim; the father, the foundation of their wealth, killed for it; and Rosa and Ezra, murdered to protect the first secret; and Caleb, trapped in the middle, a man consumed by a guilt so profound it had finally, violently ripped him apart. He wasn't just a villain. He was the story's most tragic victim, a soul so thoroughly corrupted by his own weakness and his brother's evil that his only escape was this desperate, screaming confession in the dust. The gunfight was over, brought to a stunning halt, not by bullets, but by the devastating power of a truth that refused to stay buried any longer. The silence that fell was the silence of a charnel house, filled with the ghosts of the Hendersons' many victims, finally given a voice. The stunned silence that followed Caleb's confession was a vacuum, drawing all the heat and noise from the world. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The two hired guns looked at each other, then at the broken man kneeling in the dust, and a silent, mutual understanding passed between them. The one with the broken wrist, cradling his shattered arm, staggered to his feet. "We're done," he spat, his voice thick with pain and revulsion. "This ain't our fight. Never was." Without another word, he and his companion limped toward their horses, leaving Caleb alone with his ghosts and the two strangers who had become his unwilling confessors. They didn't look back. Tobias walked over and picked up Caleb's discarded pistol, tucking it into his belt. He then retrieved his rifle from its scabbard on his own saddle. The authority had shifted completely. There was no more threat, only the grim, sordid aftermath. Finn, his body still thrumming with adrenaline, slowly lowered the hammer he was holding. He looked at Caleb, no longer a monster to be feared, but a pathetic, hollowed-out shell of a man. The hatred he had felt was replaced by a cold, unsettling pity. This was the corruption of guilt made flesh, a man so eaten from the inside out that his collapse was total and absolute. "Where is he?" Tobias asked, his voice low and devoid of judgment. "Your brother, Thomas." Caleb looked up, his eyes vacant. "Dead," he whispered. "Rattlesnake bite, a month after he had me kill Rosa, bitten right on the hand. Some folks called it bad luck. I knew what it was. It was justice. The desert. It has its own laws. He died screaming. I think he saw them all waiting for him." The poetic, brutal irony of it settled over them. The serpent in the heart of the family struck down by a serpent in the dust. The question of what to do next hung in the air, as heavy as the unburied dead. It was answered by the sound of more hoofbeats, this time from the west, the direction of the town of Redemption. Finn's first instinct was to tense up, but Tobias laid a calming hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, son," he murmured. "I reckon that's the law." He was right. A single rider appeared, moving at a steady, purposeful clip. As he drew closer, they could make out the familiar, solid figure of Sheriff Ray Garrett, a silver star glinting on his vest. He was a man whose presence commanded respect, his face weathered but fair, his eyes missing nothing. He reined in his horse, his gaze taking in the scene with a practiced, analytical calm. The abandoned wagon, the two strangers, the kneeling man, and the unmistakable shape of a shallow grave. He tipped his hat to Tobias. "McGraw, I got a strange visit this morning. A gunman, name of Silas. Said he quit a job with the Hendersons. Said he had a bad feeling. A real bad feeling. Said I ought to ride out this way toward the dry wash. Said something about a mule skinner and his boy who might be riding into a buzzsaw. The hired gun, the one with a conscience. He hadn't just abandoned his post. He'd sent for help. He had drawn a line, and in doing so, had become the unlikely agent of resolution." Sheriff Garrett dismounted, his eyes falling on the kneeling, broken figure of Caleb. "Henderson? What in God's name is going on here?" Caleb didn't have to answer. The whole story was written on his face, in the disturbed earth, in the oppressive atmosphere of guilt and death. He looked up at the sheriff, and what little resistance he had left crumbled entirely. "It's over, Ray," he said, his voice a dead monotone. "It's all over." There was no trial on the trail, just a quiet, formal confession, repeated for the sheriff in a voice devoid of all emotion. Caleb, now completely docile, seemed relieved to be unburdening himself of the years of secrets. He was a man already condemned, his soul long since executed by his own guilt. The grim work began. Under the sheriff's direction, they carefully, respectfully, finished the job Tobias had started. Maria Henderson, wrapped in a dusty blanket from the wagon, was laid gently on the ground. The simple gold ring on her finger seemed to shine with a kind of sad triumph. The truth was out. Then came the longer, more somber journey. Caleb, his hands bound loosely in front of him, led them north toward the dry wash, his steps shuffling, his head bowed. He walked like a man in a dream, pointing out the places where his memory had buried the bodies. Finn and Tobias followed with the shovels, the sheriff riding alongside them. There was little talk. The desert itself seemed to be listening, a silent witness to the exhumation of its darkest secrets. They found Rosa Martinez first, buried in the sandy soil beneath a cluster of Palo Verde trees. Then, a little further on, they found the old ranch hand, Ezra Whitmore. Each discovery was a fresh wave of horror, a confirmation of the depravity that had festered on this land. With each body they unearthed, it felt as if a weight was being lifted from the very air, as if the land itself could finally breathe again. They wrapped them, too, in blankets, and loaded all three onto the back of the Henderson wagon, which one of the sheriff's deputies, arriving later, had been sent to fetch. The journey back to the town of Redemption was slow and grim, a silent funereal procession under a sky that was turning a bruised purple and orange with the setting sun. Caleb rode with the sheriff, compliant and empty. Finn and Tobias followed with their own wagon, Copper walking steadily behind them now, his ears relaxed, his gait even. His work was done. He had stood his ground, and the dead were no longer forgotten. The town buzzed with the news, a mixture of shock, horror, and a dark, prurient curiosity. The Henderson name, once a symbol of wealth and power, was now synonymous with murder and rot. The trial was a formality. Caleb confessed to everything again, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. He detailed the sins of his brother and the sins of his own, sparing no detail. He was sentenced to hang. Finn and Tobias stayed in town until it was over. They felt they owed it to the dead. They watched from the back of the crowd as Caleb Henderson stood on the gallows, a bright, clear morning dawning behind him. He looked out over the town, his gaze empty. He offered no final words. When the trapdoor sprung, there was a collective gasp, and then a profound, somber silence. Justice, brutal and final, had been served. A few days later, Tobias and Finn were back on the trail, their wagon reloaded, heading for Silver Creek once more. The air felt cleaner, the sun less oppressive. The landscape, once a place of menace and dread, now seemed peaceful, returned to its natural state of stark, quiet beauty. Finn was different. The boyish impatience was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful maturity. He had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. He understood now the wisdom in Tobias's quiet calm, the truth in an animal's intuition. He would never again doubt the feeling of a thing being simply wrong. As they passed the spot where it had all begun, the earth was turned and settled, a faint scar on the trail that would soon be smoothed over by wind and time. But it was no longer a place of horror. It was just a place of memory. The graves in the town cemetery were marked now: Maria Henderson, Rosa Martinez, Ezra Whitmore. Their stories were known. Their souls, it was said, could finally rest. Finn reached out and ran a hand along Copper's sturdy back. The mule flicked an ear, but kept walking, his pace steady, his purpose clear. He was just a mule again, hauling goods from one place to another, but to Finn, he would forever be something more, a moral compass, a catalyst, a stubborn, silent guardian of the forgotten. He knew, didn't he? Finn said quietly, looking over at Tobias. Tobias nodded, a small, sad smile touching his lips. He looked out at the vast, open desert, a landscape that held 1,000,000 stories, most of them lost to time. Some things don't need a voice to speak the truth, son, he said. Some truths are just felt. You just have to be quiet enough to listen. They rode on in a comfortable silence, the creak of the wagon and the steady plod of Copper's hooves a peaceful rhythm. The desert was no longer just empty. It was a place of memory, of somber justice, and of a hard-earned peace, built on the unshakable certainty of a mule who had refused to let the dead be walked over, a mule who had forced the living to listen, and in doing so, had allowed a buried truth to finally find its way into the light. The scars would remain, on the land and on their hearts, but they were scars that had been earned, part of a home they were building for themselves, one splinter, one memory, one dusty mile at a time.